Okay, awesome. Well, like I said, happy Friday. I don't think this should, sorry, take us terribly long. We've already went over a couple little things, but for those of you who come in late, please feel free to pop in and ask questions. And then at the end, after I stop the recording, we'll go over some of the stuff again if we need to. So chapter 3 is about history and intercultural communication. So how do our histories intertwine with how we talk to and with other people? So humans are natural storytellers. You know, you'd get home from school and your family or whoever would say, okay, well, tell me about your day. What'd you do at school? They're asking for that story of, how your day was, what happened. But it's fundamental to our human experience. We bond with people through experiences, through stories. They help us make sense of who we are and who we think we should be and who we think other people are. And, history, it's already happened. We can't change history, we can't escape it. So we need to be able to recognize that, things have happened and not try to suppress it, because it ends up making things more complicated in the long run. So if we ignore history and ignore the things that have happened, push them to the side and say, oh, well, that stuff doesn't matter, it's in the past, then, we can come to the wrong conclusions about people. We can reinforce particular stereotypes, and we can invalidate entire groups of people and say, okay, well, yes, the Holocaust happened, but that's in the past now. People don't persecute the Jews anymore, don't persecute, the LGBT community, or don't persecute insert whatever here, because, that was 80 years ago now. So there's multiple types of history, and we will hit very briefly on a lot of types. But like I said, this is being recorded. You can always go back and reference it again. If you want to learn more about these particular ones or any of these ones, just let me know. So we have political, intellectual, social histories. We have family histories, national histories, cultural group histories, sexual orientation histories, gender histories. There's a lot. Basically, anything you could put a category on, you could have a history behind it. So more specifically, actually, no, we're going to talk about this before we go to the next slide. Sorry. It feels like a Monday morning, but it's a Friday, guys. I apologize. So what does history have to do with intercultural comm? Well, it has to do a lot with intercultural comm. So the history that we have been taught and the history that we know influences our views and our opinion about the particular instances in history are affected by our culture. It's a very cyclical relationship. So how we view our history is influenced by our culture, and how we view our culture is influenced by our personal histories and personal experiences. But when we're communicating with people from different backgrounds, from different countries, of different religions, these can have hidden barriers, because if you don't have any inkling, if you have no clue about someone's history, then you may, put your foot in your mouth or cause a miscommunication, and then you have to try to find a way to salvage that situations. There always will be times where you have miscommunications, though, where you make a faux pas or where you offend people. It's just going to happen. So just learning to say, okay, well, how can I maybe minimize these situations, being cognizant of history and people's experiences and their belief systems, so that, we can become better. Or if a situation occurs, that we can handle it appropriately. So more specifically, going back to what I thought I was going to be saying, you have like political histories, which are histories that focus on political events. So most of our history textbooks are political histories. It's about, okay, who did this thing? When was the Louisiana Purchase? How did we break away from Britain? Stuff like that. Those are all political events. And you have intellectual histories, so on the development of ideas. So how did we go from cave paintings to stone tablet writing to papyrus and like leather skin to paper to now we have digital. So that's the developing of technology, developing of ideas, could be an intellectual history. You have social histories that are everyday life experiences of different groups. So if you want to look at what the daily life or just the general, what the average person experienced during Italy in 1645, that might be a social history because you're looking at just these everyday life experiences of a specific group of people. But these are just some of the histories that can influence how we think about ourselves or as family members or members of cultural groups or as citizens of a nation, because obviously the political history of a nation affects how we see ourselves in regards to citizens of that nation. We have family histories. So our individual family. So these occur at the same time as other histories. So like you have an individual family history while other things are going on. So if you had family in the United States when the revolution was going on, American Revolution, huge part of American history, but there was also your individual family history going on then as well. But if you learn something new about your family, how might that change your feelings about how you are? So my great-grandpa was a pretty prolific cow thief and horse thief in Texas. That's part of my family history, and there's probably some interesting stories that go along with that, but that personally doesn't change how I feel about who I am, because I'm sure most of us have probably had cow thieves and horse thieves in our family history, just common profession couple hundred years ago. But you might one day learn things about, your parents or your grandparents or great-grandparents that causes you to think differently about them or to think differently about who you are or who you think you should be. We have our national history, so histories of our nation states, so US, Canada, China, Japan, Russia, Somalia. Those are all different nations. They all have their own national histories that include great events and great people. So pretty much everyone in the world knows like George Washington. Huge figure in American history, huge part of our national history and our national character. But having these shared stories gives us a shared narrative of who we are. So like the story of Honest Abe. So that gives us that shared narrative, oh, we should be honest like Abraham Lincoln. It helps solidify and bring together people and help them create a nation. Like we need those shared stories to have common ground. Because, maybe Kyler and I have nothing in common besides that we're Americans. But we have that shared sense of nationhood from these national histories that we have been told, in middle school and elementary school. But an interesting thing to kind of think about is like we talked about this in class with my Thursday class, because we were actually there in person. But our history textbooks, if you think back to when you were in middle school and high school, did they leave out anything? Were there any instances in history that our books just maybe didn't talk about? Our example was like Columbus Day. You have stuff in the history textbooks about Columbus, but they also like left out parts where he would cut off natives' hands if they like didn't want to be slaves or didn't bring in enough gold, stuff like that. And that's a pretty horrific part of history that most of us just didn't learn unless we sought it out ourselves. And how do these history textbooks and the things that they leave out reflect upon how we think of who we should be as Americans or Canadians? And then another thing to think about is, how much do you guys actually learn about the histories of other nations and of other peoples, of other cultures? I think I had 2 or 3 people in my class on Thursday said that they had taken like a world history course or like a Western civilizations course. So not too many people got any other history besides American history. Any thoughts so far on this? Anyone have anything they want to share? History is written by the victors or the people in power. You still do have some histories and stories that are written by the more marginalized, but you tend to not see those as much, just because if, like, let's say you win a war, then you have the chance to spread that information and your point of view to more people. I mean, the other side's still probably going to get out in some way, shape, or form and be able to tell their side, but a lot of the mainstream stories will probably be based on your narrative. So definitely, Ramon. We have cultural group histories. So we, of course, have our overarching national nation-state identities of, what your national origin is, what country you identify with, but you have different cultural groups within those different nation-states. So these help us understand the different groups, understand their identities. So different cultural groups could be, under the umbrella of American, could be like the Irish Americans, Italian Americans, German Americans, Chinese Americans, Americans of different religions. But I think there's actually like a religious history section too. So with some, it definitely kind of intertwines. Like some people, I think, consider, if you're Jewish, they consider it's like, no, that's your ethnic identity, or it's your religious identity, or it's your cultural identity. So a lot of these definitely intertwine a lot because, everything is interconnected. But our specific cultural group histories are, they're important to us because, they help identify us as German American or Irish American, and to say, my ancestors struggled with slavery, or my ancestors struggled with this thing. So, but if we are ignorant of, or just kind of push aside the histories of other groups within, wherever we are in America, it makes it more difficult to communicate with them, and, more susceptible to misunderstandings or accidentally, upsetting someone, like we've talked about. So, and then as Ramon said a couple minutes ago, history is written by the victors, but you also have your non-mainstream histories. So these might be more hidden histories. So it could be that contrary viewpoint of that grand overarching, American history narrative that might have been suppressed because, it's not nice that we put the Japanese in internment camps, but it happened, and luckily we know about it. But, what might be some examples of the more non-stream ones? Racial and ethnic, gender, sexual orientation, diasporic, colonial, socioeconomic, and religious. But those might be more hidden because it's not the overarching grand narrative of the American people or whatever. But they are definitely included and they are important, but they're kind of those histories within histories, because you have all of these different types of histories within, a cultural group and within a nation and within a family. So we have our racial and ethnic histories. Steve isn't in this class, but I was talking to him about this, or he mentioned it before, but our mainstream histories, they can't include everything. If you had a history of everything that has ever happened in the United States since, you first had humans over here, okay, you're looking at a book that is very, very long, or a PDF document that is probably millions of pages. We wouldn't remember all that. So the mainstream history just kind of hits the highlights, the important things. U.S. was settled and more people started coming over. We fought against the British. We won. The British came and invaded again. We kicked them out a second time, except I think they burned down the White House that time. But then, yay, we haven't really had any problems or foreign invasions on U.S. soil since. But that ignores a lot of the other histories that are going on. So racial and ethnic histories in particular, some groups tend to struggle to retain their histories, especially if they've been really assimilated into the mainstream culture. So I think it was one of my students, Steve, who did a speech on the tribal schools on the reservations. So a lot of the Native American schools were really trying to get back their ethnic culture, their ethnic identity. So they were teaching the languages, they were teaching the stories that were the language of the tribe and the stories that were important, so that they could kind of get back and retain some of that ethnic history that, in a mainstream school that they probably would not have gotten. And then, of course, since this is a non-mainstream history, injustices can get swept under the rug. Once again, like Ramon said, history is written by the victors, but some information still, obviously, it always makes it out. But if you have injustices swept under the rug, things happened like internment of Japanese Americans. Most of us know that America had concentration camps, internment camps. We didn't have gas chambers, and we weren't outright killing Japanese Americans post Pearl Harbor, but they were not treated very well. Their stuff was taken from them and they were sent into internment camps. Most of you guys are probably not old enough to remember. There might be a couple. Ramon might be old enough to remember. I guess Ramon's the only one whose age I can kind of guess. But the treatment of Muslims and even people opposed to invading the Middle East after 9/11, American Muslims were not treated very well, and neither was anyone who was willing to speak out and say that they didn't want to go invade another foreign country, because that was against the main grain. There's even people who deny that the Holocaust happened, which I think is actually illegal in Germany, and try to say, oh, that didn't happen, it was just made up or whatever. It wasn't as bad as people make it out to be. But that's an ethnic history for the Jewish people. Slavery could be a racial history, and that's a huge one, particularly here in the US. We have a very long legacy of slavery, not only with African Americans, but of Native Americans, of indentured servitude with the Irish immigrants. So that is something to keep in mind. But obviously, when you learn about injustices in history against different cultural groups, you might not have even known that your cultural group was, or your ethnic group was discriminated against at one point. If we are looking specifically at the US, basically any time that the US has gotten a wave of immigration, let's say Irish or Italian or Chinese, they've been pretty discriminated against. And that can sometimes put a damper on the celebratory nature of mainstream history, of we're like, oh yeah, we're, greatest country in the world, super awesome, we're welcoming to everyone. But if you look at the different individual racial and ethnic histories, that's not always been the case. Not to say that we are not a wonderful, great country that is welcoming to diversity, but it hasn't always been that way, and there's obviously always still work to be done. You have gender histories as more non-mainstream histories, so cultural conventions, like how did we get that women are in the kitchen and men are in the workforce? In other countries, like it might be the opposite. How do we say that, it's okay for men to do this and women to do this, or it's not okay for men to do this? So how are those created? How have they been maintained? Like what keeps them here? And then how have those been altered, or how could those be altered? So history of women told by women is a more recent phenomenon. Obviously, there's always been women in the world. But them having a chance to kind of tell their own stories is definitely a more couple centuries recent thing, because like you've always had women doctors and women academics and scholars, but it hasn't always been easy to keep the documentation of that, particularly if they've lived in a more patriarchal society. And the same would be opposite for men in a more matriarchal society. If the women have the power, then the men's stories might not get told as often. And then can think about, how is contemporary life today influenced by our gender history? So how has gender in the US influenced how we, behave today? There's actually a really, really interesting article that the BBC published earlier this week about Coco Chanel, the fashion designer, about women in men's fashion. It's really interesting to see how men designed fashion for women versus how women designed fashion for women. So Google that if that's something that interests you, just because it was quite an interesting read. You have sexual orientation histories, so history of the LGBTQ community. I can talk today, I promise. That might be often overlooked or ignored, because obviously people in the LGBT community have existed forever, kind of like women, but their stories might not have always gotten told. So, during World War II, it was not just the Jews that the Nazis sent to concentration camps. It was people in the LGBTQ community. It was the disabled. It was pretty much anyone who they didn't see as their ideal, or who, agreed with them. Books about Abraham Lincoln's sexuality. So we looked this up in our class yesterday, and there's been debate. Obviously, none of us can know because none of us were alive when Abraham Lincoln was, if Abraham Lincoln was, bisexual, because yes, he was married, he had a wife and kids, but I guess there was some information or whatever that says, hey, you know, maybe he could have liked men as well, but that's obviously not something that we hear much about. But then again, we don't know if it's true or not because none of us were alive. But if we can't listen and understand, you know, where other people are coming from and how they've been affected by things, then we can miss the important lessons. We can, you know, miss out on important information. We can miss out on making friends and create huge misunderstandings. You have diasporic history. So a diaspora is a large movement, a large migration. So these tend to be caused by war, famine, enslavement, persecution. So you had like the Irish diaspora, potato famine. Right now, it seems like we're having one from like South and Central America. So a diaspora of that area up to the US trying to escape from like the cartels. So it's a dispersal of a unified group. So that could definitely be a diaspora. So it helps us if we understand how people have migrated and why. So why did we get such an influx of Chinese immigrants in the 1800s? Well, what was going on in China? Let's see what was going on then, maybe in their national history. Was it a particular cultural group that came over here? But if we can learn why they did this massive migration, then that can make these cultural connections. So we have our colonial histories. America, I think, is technically a colonial power because we did colonize places, I believe. Hawaii, Guam, American Samoa, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico. Are there any I'm missing that we technically like own but aren't states? It might only be 5. Britain, huge colonial power. They have the British Virgin Islands. Do they have the Falkland Islands, or am I thinking of something else? Maybe I'm thinking of Shetland. No, Shetland's up north. Falkland, I think, is down south. What else did the British own? India. US was a British colony. Parts of Canada. Hong Kong. I always forget about Hong Kong, and I shouldn't because it's been in the news like 60 million times in the past 3 months. Hong Kong was a British colony. Trying to think of anything else in Asia, because I think Vietnam belonged to France. And then I think the Philippines were colonized by Spain or Portugal. I'm trying to remember like what languages places speak. You know, Quebec colonized by the French. I think Mozambique colonized by France. There's a lot of countries in this world. But if you think, oh, okay, South America, Central America, Brazil colonized by the Portuguese. Everywhere else colonized by Spain because Brazil's like the only one that speaks Portuguese and everywhere else speaks Spanish. Technically, Crimea over in the Ukraine is technically been colonized right now because Russia annexed it. You know, it's the natural state of nations, but bad joke, to expand. You know, countries want to expand, whether it be because overpopulation. If you think of Great Britain, itty bitty island with a lot of people. So if you want to grow your population and help out the people who are there on the mainland, you have to go and you have to get more resources. So, you know, Britain, not a big country, not a huge amount of natural resources. But if you go colonize another place like India for spices, then you can sell those and import goods. If you go and colonize a place like the US, a lot of natural resources, and then you can just ship those back right over to your house. And then, of course, notions of grandeur. This was a big one when colonizing the New World here through North and South America. I don't know if you guys ever heard this saying or read it in any of your history textbooks, but like the Spanish and the Portuguese were really good about colonizing for gold, God, and glory. So gold, obviously, send money back to the treasuries, make money for themselves, God to spread Catholicism, and then glory because, you know, notions of grandeur. They wanted their names to be remembered, and they wanted the king and queen to give them land or titles or insert whatever here that people wanted back in the 16 and 1700s. And we kind of talked about like the language. So, you know, the language you speak depends on, you know, where you're from and depends on who colonized it, or if that's just like the native country where they didn't spread out. So you still have a whole bunch of like native languages throughout North and South America, even if they're not widely spoken. There's a lot because, you know, while everyone might also speak Spanish or English, a lot of people still might speak that native tongue that they spoke before they were colonized. Right now, most people would say we're in a post-colonial stage. Like most colonies have been kind of let go of and said, you should probably be your own country now because it's not a good look to still have colonies. But obviously that can cause a lot of tension between, you know, that the new country and whoever colonized it. So how do those interactions go now? How do people from those two different countries or those two different cultures talk to each other? You know, are there certain things you might not want to talk about or certain things that do need addressed because of that colonial history? We have our socioeconomic class histories, which are, you know, histories of money, who makes what kind of money. We've mentioned briefly Irish immigrants, potato famine, very impoverished, moving over here for a better life. You know, that's why most people do come to the United States is, you know, socioeconomic issues. They want a better life. They want a better opportunity for them and their family because they're, you know, impoverished, living, you know, in terrible situations wherever they are, or dealing with war or civil unrest, you know, safety. You know, but it's not the only ones who are just disadvantaged. They're not the only ones who immigrate, because affluent Russians, after the revolution in 1917, where they were killing all of the Russian like aristocrats and the super wealthy, obviously you're going to flee to escape being murdered because of your wealth or because of how you were born, which family you were born into. So they left despite being very wealthy. Cubans fleeing the Cuban Revolution in 1959. A lot of Germans immigrated to Argentina after World War II. So some examples of that. But sometimes people kind of forget that socioeconomic status is, you know, is part of, you know, culture and histories. But everything's all about capital because capital and power definitely go hand in hand. So it's interesting to see. I think I was reading an article, maybe it was last year or the year before, but like immigrants from Yemen and stuff fleeing civil unrest, moving to like the UK and Western Europe, and being like highly intelligent, well-educated people. You have like doctors and stuff who were working basically like minimum wage jobs because, yeah, they had the knowledge, and they might have had like part of the financial means, if you know, because they were well educated, but they didn't have the right kind of cultural capital because they didn't speak the language. So interesting thing to think about. Religious histories, religion has been a very, very powerful force in history. Obviously, you have things like the Crusades. You have, the Puritans fleeing Europe to come over to the United States, which eventually led to war, but not outright right at the beginning. But religious persecution has led to mass migrations and diasporas. If you think of like Jewish diasporas, like we mentioned earlier, because of persecution, they've had to move around a lot. A movement of LDS out west, French Protestants leaving primarily Catholic areas to move to places where they could be free to practice their own Protestant religion, people moving and starting their own religions. So any questions so far as we wrap up, or right before we wrap up? It's like, I know it's a lot of information in a short amount of time, and like I'm right there with you. Like, I'm so exhausted. I'm sure you guys can see it in my face and hear it in my voice, but we'll finish it out. We'll get off right on time, and then you guys will be off to start your weekend. So last two slides, last two things. Obviously, history leaves a legacy. And we have to think about what are the consequences of those legacies that those things leave behind. So the legacy of slavery in America, what is the consequence of that? How does that shape how we live? How does that shape who we think we are and who we think we should be? How does that shape how we interact with people of different races and religions and different background? And how does that affect how we, hope for the future? So can we learn from the past in order to do better, to prevent something like that from happening again? To make sure that, people who may have been marginalized have a voice, and that we actually are willing to listen and not just push it off and say, oh, well, that's in the past, like that doesn't matter anymore, because it still might matter to them. Like, we can't say anything because we haven't experienced it. The people who have, they should have a chance to say it. Just like if you have experienced something and have something to say, you should have a chance to say it too. So what are some of the ways that we can help build our skills in this particular area? So just reflect on your limits of understanding. So you don't know what you don't know. There are things that, you just don't have the information for. But there's still things that you do know. So just try to understand that there's always a side to things that you may not have seen yet. So think about how history has been marketed to you. Like, not everything is always as it seems. Sometimes they're better, sometimes they're worse. How are histories important to different people in different ways? Like, if you're not Jewish, then the Jewish diaspora is probably not important to you at all. But if you are, then that might be a really important part of your family and your cultural history. Reflect on your family history. So how does this connect you with certain groups of people but might distance you from others? So how does, how you were raised or what your family believed or where they are from affect you today? And then, what can you learn from that? What can you learn from your family history and apply it to yourself and potentially others? Understand the relationship between identity and history. I mean, obviously, I've said it before, like everything's intertwined, everything is interconnected. You can't have one without the other. They are always influencing each other. And just develop a sensitivity to other people's histories. And, that's not just in a thing of like cultural history, but just in general, like, you don't know what other people have gone through, and people don't know what you've gone through. So just understand that, there's always more to people than we know on the surface. So, and the best way to learn about stuff like that is to just ask, just talk to people, communicate. Um, so that's really the best we can do. And guys, like I said, I'm sorry if I seemed really tired today. Like, for some reason, I'm just exhausted, and I'm sorry if that came across to you more than necessary, but